Cool. So, TypeScript. Woo! You guys excited? Woo! I'm excited. I've totally been nerding out. So, I'm pretty much an expert. I've been using TypeScript for about 2 weeks, so I know pretty much all about it. So, the first kind of question, I guess, is relevance to Angular. What does it have to do with Angular? You know, do I care about it otherwise? So obviously, Angular 2, the ideal is to use TypeScript for Angular applications that you write, as well as I believe they're writing some of the source in Angular as well, or excuse me, in TypeScript. But besides that, it's actually great outside of Angular, and that's part of what I want to talk about and why I wanted it to kind of be a separate talk. Is where else can you use it? What's it good for? All that goodness. So, what is it? So, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So, what that means is anything that you can do in JavaScript, you can do in TypeScript. It's just meant to be some light tooling on top. And what's cool, we'll talk about it a little bit later as well, but if you've looked at any of the ES6 stuff, a lot of that aligns with TypeScript, either stuff that TypeScript was already doing or stuff that's going to stay in alignment, which is cool. So here is a function in JavaScript. Really simple, greet, passes in a message, and we alert the message. Beautiful, huh? Is that the best script you guys have ever seen, or what? I toiled over that for hours. It should be. Totally blew it. All that time and missed opportunity. Here is some usage of TypeScript. So really simple. This is what we call a type annotation. We're saying the message, we expect for it to be a string. So obviously the reason why we'd want to do that is if somebody is using our function greet, including ourselves, at a later date, we might want to know that greet expects to have a string. So with TypeScript, if we don't pass it a string and we call greet, it's going to yell at us, which we'll learn a little bit about how it does that. But to show a little more of TypeScript, here's something else cool we can do with TypeScript. We can provide a default value for a parameter. Finally, right? If you've used other languages, you probably are used to that. And that's also coming in ES6, but it's available in TypeScript today. Anyway, so that's a brief intro to some of that. One of the next kind of important questions is where can I use TypeScript? Where would it matter? So the first part is in a browser on the client side. Put simply, like TypeScript always compiles down into plain JavaScript, so you can really use it anywhere where you would use JavaScript. So the browser is one thing, and the server is the other, with something like Node.js. Yeah. Debug in TypeScript?
Yeah, in other words,
So it creates map files automatically, and as far as I understand, they map back to the actual TypeScript files. So when you have an error, it will actually map back to the original TypeScript file for you to debug.
but if you're using Visual Studio,
Right. Yeah. So and that's a huge thing that I'll talk about a little bit. Is TypeScript is amazing for bigger solid IDEs. So TypeScript is transpiled, so it's the same as if you were to use like ECMAScript 6 and Babel, if you guys are familiar with that. Anything you have to kind of set up a workflow for with gulp or grunt. I personally hate that stuff, but it's kind of a necessary evil, and TypeScript is one of the few things that has made me willing to do that. Not to mention if you use something like JetBrains, for example, any of their editors like PHPStorm, WebStorm, any of those, if you create a .ts file, it'll automatically say, hey, I recognize this is a TypeScript file. Do you want me to automatically convert it for you? And it will. And it'll create, by default, a JavaScript file and the map in the exact same spot in the directory, or you can even configure it to concatenate those and build it into like one main file without having to set up gulp or grunt or any of that. So that immediately made it easy for me to play with it because I created a .ts file, and I was like, great, I don't actually have to set anything up. That's a huge benefit for this stuff, I feel like. It's also just a node module, so it's really easy to work with. You can set up your watchers however and do that stuff. Pretty readily available anywhere where you can use Node. So the next question is, why should I care about TypeScript? So basically, if you want to level up as a developer, TypeScript's the next step. So a big thing is resilience. This is kind of the first major benefit to me, and I like to call it star power. And so when you use TypeScript, it's going to make it more intuitive for other developers in your project. So, and you might say, Andy, I don't work with any other developers. I'm a lone wolf. I'm awesome. I got this. But tell me that when you're looking down code that was 6 months ago that you feel like you've never seen before. You're like, who wrote this? And you don't dare look at the Git blame because you know you wrote it. But you have to then deal with that code, right? So whether it's other developers or yourself in 6 months, you're going to have to deal with it, right? So TypeScript is hugely advantageous there, and I'll talk about some of why. The other big thing is productivity. TypeScript is going to be able to make you a little faster for a few reasons. One of the biggest things is catching errors before runtime. So someone brought this up earlier. Normally the flow is you code stuff, you run it in the browser, and every once in a while you get errors back, right? With TypeScript, and when you're compiling, you have this compile step where you're going to be able to catch errors before runtime. Not only that, you're catching those in an early state that in your application you may not actually run into because it might require certain runtime conditions, like something certain being passed in. But when you're using TypeScript and you're coding with it in different places, it's going to catch some of those things you wouldn't even think to test. It might work in one situation but not in another. So that's a huge thing. Like that's really, that's the primary, I'd say one of the primary benefits. And once again, this is different in different workflows. So for me, I use PHP Storm or WebStorm, and it will pop up a little terminal. So anytime I make a mistake in my code and save it, it's going to pop up and say, hey, you made a mistake. So like really quickly, I'm getting feedback, takes no time at all, and tells me what I did wrong. Hey, I expected this to be a string, or I expected this object to have this property. So the other big thing we get with that too is autocompletion. So by having these different type things, we know exactly what our different pieces of JavaScript, our functions, our classes, all that are expecting to receive and what's available in those. The other kind of cool piece with that is there's actually type definitions for third-party libraries. So what that means is when you use these other libraries, there's a whole project of these kind of TypeScripters that have gotten together called Definitely Typed, and you can go grab the definition file for it. So for even something that wasn't written in TypeScript, you can actually get a strict typed binding for all that. So you can see exactly what they expect. If it's a number, if it's a string, whether it's jQuery or some other library, whatever it happens to be, you then know what it's expecting. So once again, another place where you can kind of save some having to look at documentation potentially, or not have to run into as many bugs. Another thing I wanted to come back to too is the alignment with ECMAScript 6. What's cool is they already have some of those features. I'm pretty sure some of the features in ECMAScript 6 too were also kind of inspired from some of the TypeScript stuff. They've been doing some of this for a while. All the new features they're talking about in ECMAScript 2 or in 6 as well are making their way into TypeScript. So that stuff's in alignment, will continue to be, once again, pretty close there, just kind of really aiming to be tooling on top. So I wanted to look at some actual TypeScript here. So here's an example of some classes in TypeScript. So our first class we have here is an animal, right? We have a constructor. So nice and simple. Logs, I'm an animal. And then we have this other class, lion, that extends animal. So kind of traditional inheritance, right, if you're used to anything object-oriented. And of course, you can do these things in JavaScript now different ways, like on the prototype and that, and it does that. But what's nice is it's just clean and simple. You'll notice, too, in the extensions, you do call to the super, which runs the constructor for the parent. And it'll actually warn you if you don't do that. So once again, intelligent kind of, you can kind of learn as you go a little bit with that. It's nice and smart. Let's see. So I wanted to show what this actually looks like in JavaScript. It's a little bit ugly, but it's also pretty clean for what it does. Basically, it's doing the same stuff you would do if you were writing classes kind of in this traditional way. Once again, it's still readable. You can look through and see kind of the same stuff it's doing. The only thing that's really added up top is the kind of tool they have for extension there, which is their little tool they're using to extend those classes. But otherwise, it's just creating those classes in JavaScript. Not something that you ever have to look at, but it's good to know what it's actually kind of doing. You know, it's still JavaScript at the end of the day, and it's probably how you should have been writing your JavaScript in the first place, but it's terrible to write that way, you know. So that's the whole nice thing is it's giving you kind of the low-hanging fruit of I can, you know, use object-oriented stuff, use classes without, you know, having to use some specific class library or, you know, like now you can do it, I guess, with, you know, ES6 and Transpile, but it's really the same situation. The nice part, too, with TypeScript, you can target whatever you want. So you can target ES3, ES5, or ES6. So you kind of have flexibility for your project where you can utilize that syntax while still getting to kind of compile down to what you need, which is cool. So with the strict typing, I just wanted to talk briefly about what you can do with that. So what's nice is, you know, strict typing is one of those things that sounds really scary, I think, at first. Like, I'm like, strict typing, do I really want to strict type things and that? But what's cool is it's optional, right? So for a function, you can optionally, like how I added to the greeter, that I wanted that to be a string. I can even do that just on one parameter and not on the next. You know, just really simply I can say, I want to ensure this has a certain type, but this, give me whatever you want. You know, so it's nice because you can really kind of incrementally use it, and it's not any extra real weight to you. You know, it's only added benefit for where you do hint and types. Because then when people use that once again, they have the sort of auto-completion side of things as well as the validation of that. So there's really very little friction. Once you're running with TypeScript, like there's no headache of figuring out like, oh, I can't figure out the syntax. Just as you need it, you kind of start adding those things in, which is cool. So the types are pretty simple too. There's a Boolean type, a string type, any type, which is for if you specifically want to say this will take in anything. There's also a function. Am I missing anything else? Yes. So the next thing we'll get into, which is the exciting part, is interfaces. So how many of you guys are familiar with kind of interface patterns? Cool. A lot of you. Perfect. So interfaces, right, are a way we can say we expect certain things. Now, in TypeScript, this is a specific example I have here that I'll show. That's a kind of to-do app per se. That's not the full app here, but I'll kind of talk through what I have. So I'll actually start at the bottom. So I have this to-do controller, which is kind of like my app logic, right? Like I have this method that's, you know, when the add button's clicked, it's going to call that method, and it's going to pass in a to-do. And what's cool then is it's going to reach out to what it calls the saver and save it. So let's kind of break down what all that means. So the first thing at the very top we have is a definition of what is a to-do. Now, a to-do is basically just any object or class that has the property of ID. And in this case, it's saying optionally, so that's what the question mark is. And that it's expecting to be a number. And then it has a text property, which it expects to be a string. Now, the next interface I have here is for my to-do saver. I call it that just to keep it simple. Basically, its job is to save my to-dos, right? So what's cool is I pass things into it, it handles that, and that's all it does, right? So if you're familiar with dependency injection, this is like a service, right? So down here in my to-do controller, when I create it, it's taking in that to-do saver, and it's going to bind it to itself. I forgot to include my updated example. So there's actually an even cleaner way to do this, which I'll show you guys after. But basically, you can then bind this to-do saver in. Now, notice I'm not binding an actual class. I'm binding a interface, right? So let's see. So the whole idea is to separate the saver from the controller. So what's nice is now I can go implement my saver however I want. It might talk to a database. It might talk to an API. And what's cool is this controller, it doesn't care. It knows when it's ready to save it to do, it's going to pass it to the saver, and the saver is going to do its job. So that's the whole point of interfaces and this sort of structure into the dependency injection is this is now testable code as well, right? You know, it's nice, simple. I can have the different pieces. I could mock that really easily if I needed to and pass it in. So here I'm showing an actual implementation of it. So I'm not really doing much here, but I'm just literally implementing it. So here you'll notice it's an object. So this isn't actually a class. And this is like one of the cool things to note is when you implement something, you don't actually have to say this class implements this. And you can do that. I should have written both examples. But what's cool is you can just pass an object that has the functions on it, and that's all it needs. And it's still going to validate it and say, yes, it has the functions I'm looking for with the signatures I'm looking for. You know, it says this is accepting that parameter, et cetera, and it's going to validate that. So here I pass that into my to-do controller, and it's all happy. So it also enforces return types. And so the same thing you can see in this first create function. I'm returning what would probably be from the server, my new to-do. It probably passed me in the text of example, and I'm passing it back to the object with the ID 1 and the text example. So, you know, an ID would get assigned to the server probably, right, and it would come back. So now what's cool, once again, though, is that's still not an actual to-do class or anything. It's just validating that that object matches my to-do interface, which optionally can have the ID, right? And at that point, it's still all anonymously objects, right? Yeah. It's compile time. Yeah, it's beautiful. Assuming you're calling it from another TypeScript file. So the other example I wanted to show is just that same thing. This kind of what's really more like a struct-like usage, right? So you can have these things like options for a plugin. So I'm pretending an example here. This function is some sort of plugin, right? So when I call example, I'm showing off kind of, I can shape this sort of object and say this is what I expect, but I can pass in a completely anonymous object. You know, it doesn't have to be a certain class or anything like that. And you'll notice a couple interesting things. So here we kind of saw before, like the part 1 kind of variable up there. It is optional, so you don't see it below and it's not upset. But you also see down here, there's a part 3, and that's not declared in my interface. So once again, a good example of where TypeScript's flexible. You can have kind of open-ended things where you can add additional properties or things like that, and it's not going to complain. In this case, its job is to say, here's my contract, here's what I'm looking for from this object, and it makes sure that it's there. I wanted to kind of save some time at the end for us actually to jump in and play with some of it and kind of ask some questions and go through some of that. There's a lot to TypeScript. You know, obviously we've kind of seen just a little bit of how some of that works. You know, if you're not familiar with some of the interface concepts in that, you know, it's going to be new stuff to you anyway. If you are familiar with that, you're going to see some of the power in some of this. But once again, it's really easy kind of to step into and start using anywhere, whether it's on a server, you know, for client-side projects, for Angular, or for other things. And it's just going to kind of encourage, you know, more error-free code. You know, it's just a nice way to do it. And the more I've played with it, the more I've just fallen in love with it. Once again, it's not a ton of overhead or complexity there, but you can kind of step into those features and start getting some of the benefits. So before we get into the Q&A, I wanted to leave you guys with this important thought. So TypeScript, all the things. So definitely play with it and, you know, see what the benefits are for you. You know, try using it on just, you know, a plugin or playing with a project that way, compile it to JavaScript, see some of those benefits, you know, and then see if it makes sense for projects as well as if you're going to use Angular 2, you know, give you kind of a primer to start using that, and you'll see how you can kind of benefit when you make other tools that might connect with your Angular app or any other JavaScript, kind of the benefits of having it being strictly typed. Cool. So I think we'll just go ahead and break out in the lab and play a little bit, and kind of we can ask some questions as well. What I was going to have you guys do is go to the TypeScript website. If you just Google TypeScript or go to typescriptlang.org, they have this Learn section. Where is it? Play. Excuse me, the Play section. So here, what it's going to do is it's actually going to load up a TypeScript compiler, and so you can literally play with TypeScript right here. So I guess I'll take a few questions, I guess, before we jump into that, but just so you guys can start dabbling with that. Yeah?
So TypeScript is, how much really different is that from other languages?
So I feel like the purposes are different. CoffeeScript makes me a little sick. A lot of it's like syntactical sugar. What I really like about TypeScript is that it's really, some of these added benefits of typing and some of that stuff, and there is a little bit of syntactic sugar, but it's not significant. The point of it isn't that stuff. It's not to just make everything shorter and more concise. The point is to really give you the power of things like typing, interfaces, and all that. Right. Yeah, you can't just, jump into CoffeeScript and make JavaScript changes. Very true. So what's cool is, my whole understanding of it is there's a module system in TypeScript, and I think they're migrating to the ES6 one, or will support it as well. And then what's cool is on the way out, you can target a certain module system with the compiler. Yeah?
So for the type checking the parameters, that's only for primitives and interfaces, correct? Or is it also for classes? To anything.
Yeah, so you can say a class implements a interface. As well as, so when you pass stuff in, it'll check anything that you pass in that it meets that contract. So you can pass in an instance of a class, I believe, as well.
So like in the parameter, like you can specify that your income parameter would be string, for example.
Correct.
So my guess is you might either want to do a primitive, or you can either specify that it's a primitive or that it's one of your interfaces.
Right.
That you could like have a class.
You can type in the class.
Yeah, so you can type in an interface or a class. So you could pass in an instance of a class that doesn't have an interface, and it would still expect that.
What's also cool is if you have any of the definitely typed libraries, you can type in anywhere in your code, like let's say if you're using Angular, you can type in iscope anywhere else in your code as well to make sure that you inject that. And if you don't, it'll go off that compile time.
Yep. Yeah.
You mentioned the application for TypeScript in so was that
So I think Angular was the driving force behind that, but I imagine it's something you'll be able to use in TypeScript as well. I don't know offhand what the specific use cases would be for it, or like where you would do it, but I imagine you'd have access to something like that.
Anything you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does it supply any advanced data structures like trees or hash maps or anything?
Not that I know of. Yeah, it's just kind of your primitive types in the other places. Yeah. Yeah.
Two questions. So since it's again with the interfaces, does that mean implement more than one interface? For one object implement more than one interface?
Yes.
And also are method overload
Yes.
Yes. No, you're fine. Elijah knows all this stuff better than me, so. I don't know if it's true in ES6. I'm not familiar enough.
You don't have type.
You don't have types at all. No. Is that what you're asking? You have classes. You have classes in ES6. You don't have interfaces and that. Anything else? Yeah. With 1 point, with a yeah, I mean you can use TypeScript with anything, right? Because it's still JavaScript in that, and it can interact with other things. You can get the stuff from definitely type that project. They'll have a Angular 1 point whatever type hints for that stuff. You're not going to get all the benefits of it, right? Because it's not all going to be interacting in a strongly typed way, but you'll get a chunk of that. I don't know. I've really never known that much about Dart, but I mean, they're still pursuing it for Angular 2, so there's a team that works on it, and they've actually taken some of the concepts, like the concept of zones, from what I understand, is from Dart. So there's still some kind of innovation happening from there, but I don't think it's quite as mainstream as it was kind of headed direction-wise before. Yeah, because that was going to make it into the browser, right? Yeah. Right? Yep. Cool. Well, let's play with some stuff. If you have questions, find me or find Elijah, and we'll play with it a little bit and hang out and all that.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
So we're really just wrapping up, and like Andy said, we can jump into labs and start sort of breaking out. There's a couple spots back here where you can sit down and sort of chat with people. But we do want to give the opportunity for new individuals who want to introduce themselves to the group, and as well any recruiters or individuals who are looking for new employees to also